A woman who fled a monster with nothing but a stolen child and a stranger's address. And the monster is already coming for her. She didn't run because she was weak. She ran because staying would have killed them both. Now Bryony Ashcroft stands at the edge of the Nebraska frontier, holding a 4-month-old baby that isn't hers by blood, but is hers in every way that matters, about to knock on the door of a man she has never met. A man whose name she found in a newspaper advertisement. A man she is about to call her husband. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, this story is for you. Stay until the end, and drop a like, then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach left her at the edge of a dirt road that didn't seem to go anywhere particular. Just a rutted track cutting through yellowed grass that stretched in every direction until it became the horizon, flat and enormous and indifferent to whatever small human business was happening at its feet. The driver hadn't said a word when he set her trunk down in the mud. He'd looked at the baby once, looked at Bryony once, and then climbed back up and snapped the reins and was gone, leaving behind the smell of horse sweat and churned earth. October in Nebraska was nothing like October in Chicago. In Chicago, autumn smelled like chimney smoke and roasting chestnuts and the river going cold. Out here it smelled like nothing, or rather like everything at once, dry grass and sky and distance, a smell that had no name because nobody had needed to name it before. There were no buildings to catch the wind. It came straight at you from wherever it wanted. Bryony adjusted Lark against her shoulder and looked at the piece of paper in her other hand. She'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft. Rowan Mercer, Harlan County, Nebraska. Ranch on the Dunmore Road, 3 miles past the creek crossing. Quiet man looking for a capable woman. Will provide honest work and honest living. That was what the advertisement had said. She'd answered a dozen of them back in September, writing short, careful letters that didn't reveal much. Only Mercer had written back. His letter had been brief too, almost curt, but there was something in the plainness of it that she'd trusted more than the flowery ones. She told him about the baby in the second letter. She'd half expected silence after that. Most men wouldn't want someone else's trouble, but he'd replied within the week. A child is not a problem. Come when you're ready. 6 words. She'd stared at them for 2 days. Now she was here, standing in Nebraska mud, with a 4-month-old pressed to her chest and a trunk that held everything she owned, which wasn't much, and she was trying to remember why she'd thought this was a good idea. The wind pushed at her coat. Lark made a small sound, the particular sound that meant she was about to wake up hungry, and Bryony started walking. The creek crossing was just that, a creek, barely a foot deep at this time of year, with flat stepping stones someone had placed carefully across it. She got her boots wet anyway because one of the stones shifted and she stepped wrong, trying not to drop Lark. She stood on the far bank with 1 foot soaked and thought, well, that's appropriate, and kept walking. The ranch appeared gradually, which was somehow worse than it appearing all at once. First a windmill turning slowly above the grass line, then the dark shape of a barn, then a house, 2 stories, wood siding that had gone gray with weather, a front porch with 2 chairs on it that nobody was sitting in. There was a vegetable garden to the left of the house, mostly done for the season, bean poles standing empty and a row of pumpkins still orange against the dirt. A dog came out from around the barn and stopped 20 yards away and watched her without barking. Just watched. Bryony watched it back. She was still watching the dog when the front door opened. The man who came out onto the porch was taller than she'd pictured, which was stupid because she hadn't pictured anything. She'd been deliberately not picturing anything for weeks because she couldn't afford to be wrong again. He was maybe 30, maybe a few years older, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of forearms you got from actual work. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. He came down off the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked at the baby. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the trunk, which she'd been dragging with her free hand for the last quarter mile, and which had left a trail in the dirt behind her. "You walked from the road," he said. "The stagecoach doesn't come any closer." "I would have come to meet you. The letter said Wednesday." "It's Wednesday." He looked at the sky like he was calculating something. "I thought Wednesday was tomorrow." Bryony said nothing. She wasn't sure whether to be reassured that he'd made an ordinary mistake or alarmed that she was about to marry a man who'd lost track of the week. Lark made another sound, more insistent this time. She was definitely hungry. "Come inside," Rowan said. He moved toward the trunk. "I can manage it." "I know you can." He picked it up anyway and carried it up the porch steps without apparent effort and held the door open. Bryony stood on the porch for a moment looking at the open door. The warm air from inside moved against her face. She went in. What? The kitchen was the first room, which made sense for a working house. It was clean in a practical way, not scrubbed and arranged but maintained, nothing on the floor that shouldn't be there, dishes stacked, a cast iron pan hanging by the stove. There was a table with 4 chairs, though she guessed Rowan ate every meal alone at it. A window faced east and let in the afternoon light in a long, pale rectangle across the floorboards. On the windowsill, someone had left a coffee cup they'd forgotten about. It had been there long enough to leave a ring. He set her trunk near the bottom of the stairs and turned around. "There's food if you're hungry. Coffee's still hot. The baby needs feeding first." He nodded and turned away, going to the stove to give her privacy, which she hadn't asked for but appreciated. She sat down at the table and settled Lark and let the baby quiet herself, listening to the sound of Rowan moving around the kitchen, getting another cup, pouring coffee, setting something on a plate with the quiet efficiency of a man who spent most of his time by himself and had stopped making noise for its own sake. Lark ate, and Bryony looked around the kitchen and tried to take a slow breath. "This is what you chose," she told herself. "Now see what it is." What it was so far was quieter than she'd expected, and cleaner than she'd feared, and somehow more ordinary than anything she'd prepared herself for. She'd been preparing herself for all manner of things during the journey from Chicago. For a man who turned ugly once he had her out in the middle of nowhere where she couldn't leave. For someone who'd lied about what he wanted and would spend the first hour renegotiating. For finding the advertisement had been written by someone who couldn't actually provide whatever he'd promised. None of that was happening. What was happening was that a quiet man was making her a plate of food and not asking questions. That made her more suspicious, not less. When Lark was done, Bryony laid her against her shoulder and patted her back and looked at Rowan, who had set a plate of bread and cold chicken and something pickled on the table, and was now standing by the window with his coffee, not looking at her, looking out at the yard. "You're not going to ask," she said. He looked at her. "Ask what?" "About the baby. Who she is, where her father is, all of that." He considered this for a moment. "I figured you'd tell me what I need to know when you needed to tell me. And if I never tell you, then I suppose I don't need to know." Bryony looked at him. He wasn't performing patience. She'd known men who performed patience, who wore it as a disguise for what was underneath. This was something else. This was a man who genuinely appeared to have decided not to press her, for reasons she couldn't identify. "Her name is Lark," Bryony said. "That's a good name." "She's 4 months old. She's healthy." She paused. "She's not going anywhere." "I didn't ask her to." Bryony ate. The chicken was good. The pickled whatever it was vinegar and dill, and she didn't know what else. Outside, the dog had moved from the front of the barn to the side of it and was lying down in the weak sun. The windmill kept turning. After a while, Rowan said, "I should show you the house. Your room is upstairs. I put a crib together last week. It was my mother's, been in the attic. It's solid. You have a mother's crib." "Had a mother. She died 8 years ago." He said it without self-pity, the way you'd state any other fact. "She left some things here. I keep them." "That's—" Bryony stopped. She'd been about to say that's kind, but it wasn't the right word for it. It was something else. Careful, maybe. That's careful. That was thoughtful, she said instead, which wasn't right either, but it would do. He showed her the house. The crib was in the room across from hers, small and plain, and exactly as solid as he'd said. Someone had rubbed the wood with oil recently. You could still smell it. She put Lark down in it, and the baby looked up at the ceiling with the unfocused attention of a 4-month-old encountering a new ceiling for the first time, which she had been doing approximately every 3 days since Bryony had taken her and run. Bryony Ashcroft had not intended to become the guardian of a 4-month-old baby. It had happened the way most significant things in her life had happened, not by choice so much as by the complete impossibility of any other option. Her employment in Chicago had been as a housekeeper and occasional nurse for a family named Crow, specifically for Vivian Crow, a young woman of 20 who had married badly and knew it, and could do nothing about it because she had no money that wasn't her husband's and no family that would take her back. Bryony had come to the household at 19 and stayed 4 years, long enough to understand exactly what kind of man Damien Crow was. He was the kind of man who was charming at parties. She had watched him charm people 100 times. She'd watched him make men laugh and women trust him, watched him adjust his expression from warm to warmer depending on who he was talking to. He had good teeth and an easy way of standing and money enough that he never had to try too hard at anything. What he was at home was different, and she'd known it from her first month in the house. From the way Vivian flinched at certain sounds and apologized for things that weren't her fault. He'd never touched Bryony. She was staff, invisible in the way servants are invisible to men like Damien, something between furniture and tools. But she had watched, she had paid attention, and when Vivian got pregnant and then got sicker and then, after a difficult birth, died in the night while Damien was at a dinner engagement, he'd decided not to skip. When all of that happened, Bryony had sat next to the baby's cradle in the dark and made a calculation. The baby's name was going to be whatever Damien decided it was going to be. She would be raised by a series of nurses and housekeepers, seeing her father occasionally in the evenings when he came home not yet drunk enough to be ugly about it. She would learn, the way daughters of men like Damien Crow learned, that she was an inconvenience with decorative potential to be managed until she could be married off usefully. Or she wouldn't. The night after Vivian's funeral, while Damien was occupied with his lawyers and his accounts and the business of what Vivian's death meant for his finances, Bryony had packed what she could carry and taken the baby and walked out the back door. She had not thought it through everything. She'd had nowhere specific to go and no plan beyond not here, which in the moment had seemed like enough. She'd stayed 3 weeks with a woman named Clara who worked at a laundry and owed her a favor, and during those 3 weeks she'd read every advertisement she could find and written letters to every promising one. The baby had been nameless for 2 of those weeks. Bryony had called her little one and Sweetheart and You until the morning she woke up to the baby making noises at a thin streak of light coming in through the curtain, reaching for it like she could grab it, and Bryony had thought, lark, a bird that sings at dawn, a name for a creature that didn't know yet what the world was going to be. She had registered the birth at the county office under Lark Ashcroft and packed up Clara's spare room and gotten on a train to Nebraska. The first week on the ranch was mostly silence, punctuated by awkwardness. Bryony and Rowan were 2 people who had agreed to a legal arrangement and were now coexisting in a house and figuring out what that meant in practice. They'd married at the county courthouse 4 days after her arrival, a brief procedural thing with a clerk and 2 witnesses who were strangers and who shook hands and left immediately after. Rowan had signed what he needed to sign. Bryony had signed what she needed to sign. She'd expected to feel something significant at the moment when it became official. But what she'd felt instead was tired and obscurely relieved, like setting down something heavy she'd been carrying for a long time. The actual arrangement of daily life took longer to figure out. She got up before he did, which surprised her. He'd struck her as an early riser. He looked like one, the type who came awake quickly and completely. But she'd always risen before dawn, habit from years of having more work to do than hours to do it. And the first morning she came downstairs and found the kitchen empty and the stove cold. She'd lit it herself and had the coffee going by the time she heard his boots on the stairs. He'd stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her with an expression that was partly surprise and partly something harder to name. "You didn't have to," he said. "I was awake." He'd poured himself a cup and sat down across from her, and they'd drunk coffee across the table from each other in the gray early light for 10 minutes without talking. And somehow that had been easier than the talking. She started learning the work of the ranch the same way, by watching and then doing without asking permission. The kitchen garden was finished for the year, but there was still work in it, beds to clear, soil to turn, things to put by before the hard freeze. She found tools in the barn and used them. The first time she came in with mud on her boots and her hands and a basket of the last small cabbages and set them on the kitchen table, he'd looked at her with that same expression, the one she couldn't quite identify. "I would have gotten to that," he said. "You had the south fence to mend." "How did you know about the south fence?" "I walked the property this morning." He was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Before you woke up." He didn't say anything about it. He just picked up one of the cabbages and turned it over in his hand, checking it the way you'd check something you'd paid attention to, and set it back down. The thing she was learning about Rowan Mercer was that he showed what he thought through what he did more than what he said. He mended the south fence that afternoon and came back and looked at the cabbages she'd sorted on the table and moved on without comment. But the next morning he'd fixed the loose hinge on the barn door that she'd noticed and mentioned to nobody, and she understood that he'd understood something without either of them having said it directly. This was also vaguely unsettling. She was accustomed to men who talked constantly about what they were going to do and then did less than half of it. Rowan just did things. The town of Harker's Fork was 3 miles from the ranch, a scatter of wooden buildings along a main street that the locals called the Avenue, without apparent irony. There was a general store, a post office that also served as a telegraph office, a livery, 2 saloons, a doctor's office, and a church. On her first visit, Bryony had gone to the general store for supplies and felt the attention of the room shift when she walked in, the particular quality of attention a small settlement gives to someone new, which is total and barely disguised. The woman behind the counter was Edith Graves, who owned the store with her husband, and who Bryony would later learn knew everything about everyone in a 10-mile radius, not from nosiness exactly, but from the fact that at one time or another, everyone needed something from Edith's store, and people tend to talk while they're shopping. "You're the Mercer woman," Edith said. Not a question. Bryony Mercer, Bryony agreed, which was the first time she'd used the name out loud, and it sat strangely in her mouth, like trying on a coat that mostly fit. Edith looked at the baby. "That's a small one. 4 months. She's his?" The question was asked with the directness of someone who believed in asking questions the way other people believed in breathing, not rudely, just necessarily. Bryony met it the same way. "She's mine," Bryony said. "He's claimed her as his." Edith seemed to be calculating something. Then she said, "He's a decent man, Rowan Mercer. Quiet. Doesn't trouble people." A pause. People wondered about the advertisement. Did they? A man doesn't advertise for a wife unless there's something wrong with him, the thinking goes. The thinking, Bryony said, could apply equally to a woman who answers one. Something in Edith's face shifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "What do you need?" Bryony handed over her list. The talk in Harker's Fork was something she learned to navigate rather than fight. There was plenty of it, and not all of it was mean. Some of it was the ordinary interest of people whose lives didn't have much variety, and some of it was genuine curiosity that wanted to be friendly but didn't know how to ask. She made no special effort to explain herself or win anyone over. She did what she needed to do and paid cash and was polite when politeness was warranted and firm when it wasn't. The women who warmed to her first were the ones who'd done hard things themselves. A woman named Ruth Halsey, who ran the laundry with her daughter and who'd buried 2 husbands and wasn't planning on a third. A woman named Agnes Polk, who homesteaded alone on 60 acres east of town and who didn't have patience for anyone, which paradoxically made her easy to trust. These were women who'd learned to size people up fast because their circumstances required it, and what they saw in Bryony was someone who'd done the same. The men were more cautious around her, which she was fine with. November came with the first real cold, not the polite cold of October, but the kind that meant business, that came in overnight and turned the ground iron hard and didn't apologize. Bryony woke one morning to frost on the inside of the bedroom window and a sound she couldn't place coming from somewhere in the house, a rhythmic, soft sound like breathing, but not quite. She got up and went to Lark's room first, but the baby was asleep and the crib was fine. She went downstairs. Rowan was at the kitchen table. He had a piece of wood in his hands, thin-cut birch, pale and smooth, and a small carving knife, and he was working something out of it slowly, shaving thin curls that fell on the table around his hands. He looked up when she came in. He didn't look like he'd been asleep yet. "What is that?" she asked. He turned it over so she could see. It was a bird. Rough still, just the shape of it. The general idea of wings folded, a beak suggested more than carved. But it was clearly a bird. "For the baby," he said. "When she's bigger." He paused. "She doesn't have any toys." Bryony looked at it. She'd noticed that too, the absence of toys, and had been planning to do something about it on the next trip to Harker's Fork, and she'd set it aside in the mental list of things to set aside and come back to. "A lark," she said. He looked at the carving. "Trying. I'm better with fences." She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but it was close. She went to the stove and put the kettle on and stood with her back to him for a moment longer than she needed to, collecting herself. "Don't," she told herself, "not the laughing. The laughing was fine. The thing underneath it. The beginning of this is a person I could trust." That was the thing she needed to be careful about. She'd trusted a person before. She'd trusted that Damien Crow's charm meant something real. She'd trusted that the family she worked for was a family and not a performance. She'd trusted that Vivian, for all her fragility, was safer than she actually was. She wasn't going to let herself be stupid again. She made the tea and brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him and watched his hands work the wood. The careful, patient strokes of someone who understood that you couldn't rush what wasn't ready. They sat like that for a long time. The stove ticked as it heated. Outside, the frost deepened and the stars went on doing whatever stars did over Nebraska, which was the same thing they did everywhere, burning and burning, indifferent and permanent, unimpressed. The letter arrived in the first week of December. She almost missed it. She was the one who went to the post office that week. Rowan was occupied with a problem in the barn, something with the roof that was going to need attention before the serious snow, and she'd gone in for the ordinary things, a parcel from a dry goods catalog she'd ordered from any business correspondence Rowan was expecting. Behind the counter was an elderly man named Carver, who had worked at the post office so long that people sometimes forgot it was a building and thought it was just an extension of Carver himself. He handed her the parcel, 2 letters for Rowan, and then a 3rd envelope he held slightly differently, which she noticed. "This one's for you," he said. "Came from Chicago." Only 3 people in Chicago knew she was in Nebraska. Clara, who she'd made swear to secrecy. A lawyer she'd written once to ask about a procedural question she never followed up on. And one other person. One she hadn't given her address to. One who didn't know where she was. She took the envelope and walked out to the street and opened it standing on the boardwalk in the cold. The handwriting was neat and controlled. Damien Crow had always had good handwriting. He'd been proud of it. "Miss Ashcroft, I believe you have something that belongs to me. I am a patient man, and I have resources. I would encourage you to consider your situation carefully before making choices that will be difficult to unmake. I will find you regardless of your efforts to prevent it. I have found you already, in some measure. This letter reaches you, does it not? I hope we can settle this as reasonable people. I look forward to your response. D.C." Bryony read it twice. She folded it along its original lines and put it in her coat pocket and stood on the boardwalk of Harker's Fork, Nebraska, and felt the ground tilt slightly under her feet the way it does when something you'd been managing to not think about becomes suddenly real. She'd known he would look. She'd known it wouldn't stay quiet. She'd known this wasn't over. She'd always known that on some level, which was why she hadn't let herself believe in anything too hard. But she'd started to, in spite of herself. In the careful silence of the kitchen in the early mornings, in the frost on the windows and the carving of a small bird, in the sound of lark beginning to laugh, a real laugh, the whole-body delight of it, for the first time last week on Rowan's kitchen floor. She'd started to believe in it, just a little. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed the cold air and let herself feel it fully for 30 seconds. The fear, the anger, the particular sick recognition of someone you thought you'd left behind making themselves known again. She let all of that happen in the 30 seconds, and then she folded it down somewhere manageable and walked to the livery to get the horse. She didn't tell Rowan that night. She needed to think first. She didn't tell him the night after either. She told herself it was because she was still deciding what to do, which was partly true. The other part, the part she didn't examine closely, was that she didn't want to watch the thing on his face that happened when people found out her situation was harder than they'd thought. The recalculation. The pulling back. She'd seen it in Clara's face. She'd seen it in the lawyer's brief silence on the other end of a letter. The moment when a person decided what you'd brought to their door was more than they'd agreed to. On the 3rd day, she came down to breakfast and Rowan was already at the table. He looked up when she came in, and whatever he saw on her face made him set down his coffee cup. "What happened?" he said. Not as something wrong, not "you don't look well," just "what happened?" as if the conclusion was already clear and only the content was missing. She sat down. She put the letter on the table between them. He read it without touching it, just leaning forward over it, and when he was done, he sat back and looked at her with an expression that was very controlled in a way that told her there was something underneath the control that was less controlled. "How long have you had this?" he said. 3 days. He was quiet. She braced for the calculation she'd been dreading, the visible shifting of costs and benefits, the moment when she'd watch him decide how much of this was too much. "His name," Rowan said. "Damien Crow. He's wealthy." "Yes? Lawyers. The best kind." He looked at the table. He picked up his coffee and drank some of it. He put the cup down. "Then we'll need better ones," he said. Bryony looked at him. He was looking at the letter now, not at her, with the focused expression of a man thinking through a problem rather than away from it. "You don't know what you're agreeing to," she said. "I'm not agreeing to anything yet. I'm thinking." He looked up. "Tell me all of it. From the beginning. I need to understand what we're dealing with." "We." He said it without apparent effort, without performing it, just used it the way you'd use it if it were simply true. She noticed this and filed it away and didn't make anything of it right away because she was still too careful for that. But she told him. All of it. Vivian and the household and what she'd watched for 4 years and what had happened after the birth and the funeral and the night she'd walked out the back door in the dark with a baby and everything she owned in 2 bags. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the same flat tone she'd used to report a weather pattern. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. Rowan sat with it for a long time, long enough that she started to prepare herself. Then he said, "You kept letters." "I kept everything. Every letter, every note, anything I saw that mattered. I have documentation going back 3 years. He nodded slowly. "And witnesses?" "Vivian's doctor, 2 of the household servants who left before me. I know where one of them is," she paused. "Enough, maybe. I don't know if it's enough." "We'll find out," Rowan said. He stood up and picked up the letter from the table and handed it back to her. "Don't throw that away. We're going to need it." He went to the barn to finish the roof. Bryony sat at the table with the letter in her hands and the morning light widening across the floor, and Lark woke upstairs and started making sounds. Morning sounds. The announcement of hunger and wakefulness that 4-month-olds make with total confidence that someone will respond. Bryony got up and went to get her. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall on Harlan County, Nebraska. Small and purposeful, the kind that sticks. The snow that started falling the morning Rowan read Damien Crow's letter didn't stop for 3 days. It came down steadily, without drama, the way the worst winters announce themselves, not with a storm, but with a quiet, accumulating weight that you don't fully register until you open the door and find the world has been rearranged while you weren't watching. By the second day, the creek was frozen solid. By the third, the barn roof that Rowan had been working on had 6 inches of snow on it, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes your face ache if you stay outside more than 10 minutes. Bryony learned what winter on the frontier actually meant during those 3 days. It meant the animals needed twice the attention, water troughs frozen over and needing to be broken up every few hours, feed carried through snow that came up past your knees in the drifted places. It meant the house had to be managed differently. Wood stacked close to the door, the stove kept going through the night, a particular choreography of warmth maintenance that Rowan moved through with the ease of someone who'd done it many winters, and she moved through with the determination of someone learning fast because the alternative was being cold and useless. She was not going to be useless. The third morning, she was up before 4, which was earlier than usual even for her, because Lark had been restless in the night. Not sick, just awake, the kind of wakeful that babies sometimes get for no reason anyone can explain. And once Bryony was up, she couldn't see the point of going back to bed. She fed the baby and settled her and went downstairs and found Rowan already at the stove, which meant he'd been up even earlier, which she was beginning to understand was a pattern. She wasn't sure he slept much. She didn't ask. They drank coffee in the dark before the lamps were lit, the stove throwing orange light across the kitchen floor, the wind working at the corners of the house with a sound like something trying to get in. After a while, Rowan said, "I'm going to write to a lawyer in Kearney, man named Whitfield. He handles land disputes mostly, but he's sharp. I want his opinion on where we stand." "I can write to him myself." "You could. But a letter from a husband carries different weight, legally speaking, than one from a wife. I don't like it any more than you do, but that's what's true. He paused. I'll write it. You tell me what to put in it. It was a reasonable division of something unreasonable, and she recognized it as such, even if the recognizing sat uncomfortably. She'd spent 4 years watching a man use the legal weight of husbandhood as a weapon. The same instrument in Rowan's hands felt different. He was offering it, not wielding it, but her instinct was still to flinch from it. Fine, she said. Also, he said, you should think about which witnesses you can actually reach. A name and a location isn't enough if the person won't speak. I know that. Do you know if they will? She thought about the 2 former household servants she'd mentioned. One was a woman named Petra, who'd worked as a cook in the Crow House for 2 years before leaving. Bryony knew she'd gone to relatives in Omaha, had the street but not the house number. Petra had seen enough. The question was whether she'd say so. She'd been frightened of Damien in a particular bone-deep way that Bryony understood completely. The kind of frightened that doesn't go away just because you've put distance between yourself and the source of it. The other was a man named Eli Marsh, who'd been a groundskeeper. A young man, 20-something, who'd given his notice 3 months before Vivian died, and who Bryony had heard was now working at a hotel in Lincoln. Eli had witnessed one specific incident in the garden that Bryony had not witnessed herself, but that Eli had told her about afterward with shaking hands, and the look of someone who needed to say it to someone to make sure they hadn't imagined it. Petra might, Bryony said. Eli, I think he would if he understood that it mattered. Then we write to both of them. She looked at him across the table. You're moving fast. Crow's already moving. That letter took time to write and send. He's been looking for you since before he wrote it. She knew that. She'd known it the second she read the letter, the cold certainty of it. He hadn't found her address through luck. Someone had talked, or he'd hired someone, or both. The letter was a test as much as a threat. It told him that the address was real when she received it, which she effectively confirmed by existing at this address and continuing to exist here. I should have moved on, she said, not asking for reassurance, just saying the thought out loud. To where? She didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't had another plan. Nebraska and Rowan Mercer's advertisement had been the plan, the whole of it, and beyond that there had been nothing but the general direction of away from Chicago and the hope that away would be far enough. Moving doesn't solve it, Rowan said. He'd find you again. Men with money and lawyers find people. Running just delays it and costs you ground. So we stay and fight. That's what I think, but it's your decision. She looked at him and he looked back at her, steady, waiting, not pushing. She thought about what it cost him to say your decision when the fight was going to land on his land and in his house and against his name. We stay, she said. He nodded once and picked up his coffee, and that was the end of that conversation and the beginning of a different kind of work. The letter to Whitfield went out that same week. Bryony sat across the table from Rowan while he wrote it, and they composed it together, sentence by sentence. Her telling him the facts in the plainest terms she could manage, and him translating them into the language of legal correspondence, which was its own dialect. She was surprised by how well he wrote, not flowery, not labored, just clear and precise in the way that some people who read a great deal become without intending to. There were 3 shelves of books in the front room that she'd noticed on her first day and hadn't commented on. She'd been revising her understanding of him steadily since she'd arrived, and this was another revision. You read a lot, she said when the letter was done and he was addressing the envelope. Long winters, he said. Most men I knew with long winters drank through them. I did some of that too when I was younger. He sealed the envelope. Less interesting than it sounds. She almost asked something then. Something about the winters alone, about what it had been like before she came. Whether the advertisement had been as strange to write as it had been for her to answer. She didn't ask. They were still 2 people in a careful arrangement, and personal questions felt like territory she wasn't sure she had rights to yet. Instead, she said, I'll write to Petra tomorrow. Good. He stood up. I've got the east pasture fence to check before it gets dark. Post says we'll have more snow tonight. He went. The kitchen was quiet. Lark, in the crib Bryony had moved downstairs near the stove for warmth, slept through all of it with the absolute unconscious confidence of a baby who had decided, for reasons of her own, that this was a safe place. Bryony hoped she was right. Winter settled in and they settled into it, the three of them. The days developed a shape: early rising, the animal chores that couldn't wait, breakfast, then whatever the day needed, fence work or wood splitting or the ongoing business of keeping a ranch functional in weather that didn't make anything easy. Bryony took the indoor work when Lark needed minding and the outdoor work when she didn't. She was learning things at a rate that surprised even herself. How to read the sky for incoming weather, which the ranchers out here did as casually as reading a newspaper. How to tell when a calf was in trouble before it was obviously in trouble. How to work with cold hands and not let the cold make her clumsy, which was a discipline of focus more than anything physical. Rowan was a patient teacher when she asked him things, and practical when she made mistakes. She dropped a full bucket of feed once, completely, stupidly, lost her grip on it, and watched it go over and spread across the barn floor, and stood there furious at herself. And he looked at it and picked up a second bucket and handed it to her and said, "Start again," without tone, and went back to what he was doing. She'd expected more. She'd expected the kind of tight-faced disapproval she'd learned to watch for, the quiet punishment of a man recording your failures. What she got instead was a man who appeared to genuinely consider spilled feed a problem to solve, rather than an occasion to make her feel bad about. This was disconcerting in ways she was still sorting out. Lark was changing fast, the way babies do in those months. Not gradually, but in sudden leaps. One week the same, and then the next week something new had come online. She started reaching for things with intention, not just waving her arms, but actually directing them. She started laughing more. The real full-body laugh that Bryony had first heard on the kitchen floor weeks ago, and which hadn't gotten less startling. She started watching Rowan with a particular focused attention, tracking him when he moved through a room, which Bryony noticed and said nothing about. He noticed too. She caught him noticing, more than once. He'd be across the room doing something and feel the baby's gaze on him, and look over, and Lark would hold eye contact with the absolute confidence of an infant who hadn't learned yet to be uncertain about her own interest, and something in Rowan's face would shift. Not a smile exactly, something quieter than that, but a kind of acknowledgement. "I see you seeing me." One evening in January, he was sitting near the stove after dinner with the carving he'd been working on. The bird for Lark, considerably more refined now, the wings taking proper shape. And Bryony was across the room mending a tear in one of her work shirts. Lark was on the floor on a folded blanket between them. She'd been working on rolling over for 2 weeks, doing the preliminary motion of it, rocking sideways and not quite making it all the way. That evening, she made it. She got her arm underneath her and pushed and went over. And then she was on her stomach, and she looked up with an expression of complete astonishment at what her own body had done. Rowan set down the carving. He looked at the baby. "She did it," he said. "She did." Bryony was already watching. Lark made a sound of considerable complaint, having gotten herself onto her stomach and now discovering that she didn't entirely know what to do from there. Rowan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and studied her. "She needs to figure out how to push back up," he said. "She'll get there." "How long does that take?" "I don't know exactly. I've only had her 4 months. He looked at her. "You seem like you know what you're doing." "I fake a lot of it," Bryony said. "She's never had a mother before, and I've never been one before, so mostly we're both figuring it out at the same time." It was more than she usually said. She felt the edge of it as it came out and watched him receive it without making it into anything. He just looked back at Lark, who was working diligently on the problem of her own arms. "She's lucky you took her," he said. "I'm not sure luck is the word for what started all this." "No," he agreed. "But here now, she's lucky." Bryony said nothing. She went back to her mending. The stove clicked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass of the frozen pasture, and the night came down cold and clear, and Lark eventually figured out that if she turned her head a certain way, she could see Rowan, and she looked at him for a long time with that focused, curious attention, and he looked back at her with something that was careful and unguarded at the same time. The way people look at things they didn't expect to find themselves caring about. February brought 2 things: a response from the lawyer Whitfield and a response from Petra. Whitfield's letter was long and written with the particular precision of a legal mind that had trained itself to present bad news as simply information. The substance of it was this: Damien Crowe, as the biological father, had a significant claim under current Nebraska statutes. The fact that Bryony had left Chicago without formal documentation of guardianship or custody worked against her. However, and Whitfield underlined this, which told her something about the man, the documented history of the father's conduct, if it could be substantiated by witnesses and physical evidence, would be relevant. A pattern of neglect and mistreatment, established clearly in court, would give a judge grounds to deny custody regardless of biological claim. Whitfield wanted to take the case. He named a fee that was larger than Bryony had hoped and smaller than she'd feared. Rowan read the letter twice and folded it carefully. "We can cover the fee," he said. "That's not a small amount." "No." He didn't elaborate, just said it the way you'd say something is what it is. "You'd spend that on this." He looked at her, and for a moment she got the sense she'd asked something he considered obviously answered. "She's my daughter," he said, "on paper and by choice. So yes." Bryony put the letter on the table and looked at it, and then looked away at the window. The yard was gray with late winter, the snow old and compacted now, ice in the low places. Somewhere out past the barn she could hear the cattle moving. Petra's letter was shorter and harder to read, not because the handwriting was poor, but because what was in it cost something. She could feel it in every line, the way a person writes when they know that what they're writing could either help or destroy, and they haven't decided yet which they're more afraid of. Petra confirmed she was in Omaha. She remembered. She said that twice. "I remember. I have not forgotten." She said she'd been trying not to, trying to leave it all where she'd left it. But she said something else, near the end. "If someone will stand with me, I will stand." 3 words in the middle of that sentence that Bryony read 3 times. "I will stand." She wrote back that same day. She said she would stand with her. She said the lawyer's name and told Petra to write to him directly if she preferred, that Whitfield would protect her as much as the law allowed. She said she understood what it cost. She said she wouldn't forget it. She didn't cry when she wrote it. She'd trained herself out of crying years ago for practical reasons, but her handwriting was not entirely steady, and she noticed that and let it be. March arrived with a grudging loosening of the cold, and with it a change in the rhythms of the ranch. More hours of light meant more hours of work, the kind that had been waiting all winter, fence sections that had suffered under the snow, a section of barn roof that needed replacing, the spring planting to plan. Bryony threw herself into it with the particular energy of someone who needed the work to be loud enough to drown out the waiting. Because they were waiting, all of them, for Damian Crow to make his next move, for Whitfield to say he was ready, for some sign that the ground under them was as solid as it felt. She started a garden plan in late February, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and working out what to plant and where. She'd done kitchen gardens before, always in service of someone else's house, and doing it for her own felt different. Or rather for the ranch, for the 3 of them, which was still something she was adjusting to thinking of as a category that included her. She sketched out beds for potatoes and carrots and turnips, a longer row for beans, a section for things that were harder to justify by pure practicality but that she wanted anyway, tomatoes that took more tending, some herbs. Rowan looked over her shoulder at the plan one morning. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You've got the bean row in the shade of the barn after noon." She looked. He was right. She hadn't accounted for where the shadows moved. "I'll move it. Shift the whole east section over about 12 feet. She redrew it. He watched. "You know about planting," he said. "I know a fair bit. I didn't have land before." She paused, marking the new bean row. "There's a difference between knowing about something and being able to do it the way you actually want to." He was quiet for a moment. "I know a fair bit about a lot of things I never had the shape for, to do them right." She looked up at that. He was looking at the plan, not at her, but the sentence had a quality of something said carefully, chosen rather than offered without thought. She didn't ask what he meant. She thought she understood, at least partly. She went back to the garden plan. In the middle of March, a stranger appeared at the edge of the property. A man on a horse who sat at the tree line for 20 minutes doing nothing Bryony could make sense of. She was in the yard with Lark bundled against her chest and a load of laundry that she was bringing in from the line, and she saw him and stopped and he looked back at her and then turned the horse and left without ever coming closer. She couldn't make out his face at that distance. She told Rowan that evening. His face did the controlled thing it did when he was keeping something in. Where exactly? She described it. He went outside after dinner and came back an hour later with the look of a man who'd checked the perimeter of his property with the attention you'd give to something that mattered. Tracks, he said. He was out there a while before you saw him. Crow's man. Probably. She felt the cold run through her that had nothing to do with the weather. He's watching the ranch. He's letting us know he can watch it. There's a difference. He sat down across from her. It's a scare tactic. If he wanted to take her, he'd move through lawyers, not send some man to sit at the tree line. He wants me to run. He wants you to make a bad decision. Either run, which makes you look like you're hiding something, or panic and make a mistake. He folded his hands on the table. So we don't do either of those things. Bryony looked at him. How are you this calm? He considered it. I'm not particularly, but getting upset about it doesn't change what the options are. Does anything upset you? Some things. He didn't name them. He looked at the table and then back at her. He's trying to make this feel like it's between him and you, like it's a personal thing he can win by applying enough pressure. He's wrong about that. What's it actually between him and what a judge thinks? Rowan picked up his coffee. And we've been working on that for 2 months. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling, to larks breathing through the open door, to the wind coming off the plains, and she thought about Damian Crow sitting in whatever comfortable room he occupied, writing his careful letters, sending his men to tree lines, being patient the way he'd always been patient, the slow patient kind of cruelty that knew it had resources and time. She thought about Vivian, who'd had neither resources nor time, and who'd spent 4 years hoping that love was enough to change what it couldn't change. She wasn't Vivian. She'd known that the night she walked out the door. She'd chosen to know it, deliberately, the way you set something in place that you're afraid might slip. In the morning, she got up before Rowan, lit the stove, fed the baby, and went out in the pale early light to start the garden beds. The ground was still cold but workable, the frost barely a finger depth now, and she put a shovel in it and turned the first row of earth and watched it break open, dark and damp underneath, smelling of iron and old roots and something alive that the winter hadn't killed. She worked until the light was full and the ranch was awake around her, and there was coffee on the stove inside, and she did not think about Damian Crow standing at a distance watching for a woman who would run. She thought about the beans she'd plant in 3 weeks, and where to find the best seed and whether the south-facing wall of the barn would be warm enough to start tomatoes early. It was not a perfect morning. Her back hurt, and the ground was hard, and Lark woke early and fussed for 20 minutes for reasons known only to Lark. When Bryony came inside with dirt on her hands and her boots, Rowan was at the stove with the baby on his hip, and a pan tilted at an angle that suggested he'd been managing both with limited success. There was egg on the stove edge. She didn't want to stay in the crib, he said. She never does in the morning. I've noticed. He looked at the egg situation. I had a plan. How's it going? About how you'd expect. She washed her hands and took the baby, and he went back to the eggs, and she watched him work at it without grace, but with genuine effort, and she thought, this is what it is then, not smooth, not what she'd have designed if she'd been designing it. A man who kept track of weeks imperfectly, and burned things sometimes, and carved birds in the middle of the night, and meant what he said about legal fees and daughters. A kitchen with egg on the stove edge, a morning that was ordinary and complicated and, in its way, sufficient. Rowan scraped the pan and looked at the result with the critical eye of a man who knew he'd done better and didn't intend to be defeated by breakfast again. He put the eggs on 2 plates and set them on the table and sat down. Whitfield wrote again, he said. Came yesterday while you were at Halsey's. He wants us to come to Kearney. Bryony settled Lark on her knee. When? He said as soon as possible. He's heard from Crow's lawyers. She looked down at the baby, who was reaching with both hands for the edge of the table, testing distances, trying to understand what was within reach. Then we go to Kearney. I'll send the reply today. She nodded. She picked up her fork. Outside, the March wind moved through the yard and the new season pushed at everything, impatient with the cold, insisting on itself in the way of springs that have been held back too long. Not gently, not gracefully, just steadily, with the full intention of arriving regardless. The road to Kearney took most of a day by wagon, which meant leaving before first light and arriving in the early evening with a baby who had strong opinions about wagon travel and expressed them at length somewhere around the second hour. Bryony held Lark against her chest and watched the flat country move past and thought about what Whitfield had written, that Crow's lawyers had made contact, that they were proposing a meeting, that things were moving faster than anyone had expected. Whitfield's office was on the second floor of a building on the main street, above a surveyor's office, reached by an exterior staircase that was practical rather than welcoming. The man himself was smaller than she'd pictured, compact and precise, with the kind of face that gave away very little until it chose to. He shook Rowan's hand and then Bryony's, which not everyone did, and he looked at Lark with the brief professional attention of a man cataloging relevant facts. "She's healthy," he said. "Yes," Bryony said. "Good. That matters." He gestured them toward chairs. "Crow's lawyers have filed a preliminary claim in Cook County, Illinois. They're arguing jurisdiction on the grounds that the child was born in Chicago and the biological father resides there. They want the matter heard in Illinois, not Nebraska." Rowan said, "Can they do that?" "They can try. We'll fight it." Whitfield sat down behind his desk. "The jurisdiction question is actually useful to us, in a way. It buys time. Every month we delay is a month the child has been in your care, in an established home, on the record. Judges notice continuity." He looked at Bryony. "You brought the documents you mentioned?" She'd brought everything. She'd spent 3 evenings before the trip going through the box she'd kept under the floorboard in the bedroom. Letters, notes, a page torn from the Crow household's own account book, showing entries she'd recorded on Vivian's behalf. 3 letters Vivian had written to her own sister that the sister had returned unopened and that Bryony had retrieved from the Crow house trash. She laid them on Whitfield's desk with both hands as though she were setting down something breakable. Whitfield went through them without rushing. He handled each one carefully, reading, turning some over to check the backs, setting them in a sequence that meant something to him. The room was quiet except for Lark occasionally trying to grab the edge of Bryony's coat. Rowan sat with his hands on his knees and watched Whitfield's face the way you watch weather. "These letters Vivian wrote," Whitfield said finally. "The ones returned by the sister. Did Crow know about them?" "He read all her correspondence. She knew that. That's partly why she stopped writing, which means she was isolated deliberately." "Yes." Whitfield set the letters down and folded his hands. "I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Mercer. What you have here is sufficient to paint a clear picture of a man who was negligent, controlling, and cruel to his wife. That is damaging to his character. But Vivian Crow is dead, which means she cannot testify, which means a great deal of this is one person's account of a pattern of conduct." He paused. "What changes the calculation is the witnesses, Petra Voss in Omaha and this man Eli Marsh. If they testify to specific incidents, to things they personally observed, then we move from pattern to evidence. Do you understand the distinction?" "Just both sides." "Yes," Bryony said. "I've been corresponding with Petra. She'll testify." "Has she said so in writing?" "Her last letter said she would stand if someone stood with her." "Get me a letter that uses the word testify," Whitfield said. "Lawyers for the other side will argue ambiguity if she gives them room to." "What about Marsh?" "I haven't found him yet. I know he was in Lincoln at a hotel, the Hartley, I think, but that was months ago." Whitfield wrote something on the pad in front of him. "I'll have someone look." He looked up. "There's one more thing. Crow is going to request a visit." The room shifted slightly. Bryony felt Rowan go still beside her. "A visit," she said. "He'll frame it as a concerned father wanting to see his child. It's a legal maneuver as much as anything else. It establishes his interest on the record, makes him appear reasonable to a judge. He'll be accompanied by his lawyers and possibly an independent evaluator." Whitfield looked at her steadily. "You cannot refuse it, Mrs. Mercer. Refusing a visit from a biological parent prior to any custody determination is very difficult to defend legally, and it will be used against you. What you can do is control the circumstances." "He's not coming into this house," Rowan said. His voice was even and completely inflexible. "He won't need to. The meeting can occur at a neutral location, here in Kearney, in my office, or at any site you designate that isn't your home. I'll be present. You'll both be present." Whitfield looked at them each in turn. "I know what I'm asking you to sit through, but the goal here is the courtroom, and everything before the courtroom is preparation for how you'll look inside it. The drive back from Kearney was quieter than the drive out. Lark had finally exhausted herself and slept across Bryony's lap, heavy and warm, one fist loosely closed around nothing. The evening settled into the flat land and turned the grass amber and then gray, and then the stars began to appear, not gradually but all at once, the way the Nebraska sky does it. Nothing, and then everything. Rowan drove without talking for a long time, which she'd come to understand was not absence but thinking. She watched the road ahead and thought about what Whitfield had said, about the visit, about sitting in a room with Damian Crowe and his lawyers and pretending that the circumstances were something a reasonable person could navigate with calm. "I can do the visit," she said. "I know you can." "I'm not sure I said that because it's true. I think I said it to hear myself say it." He glanced at her. "That's probably a useful kind of lying." She looked at him. "Was that a joke?" "Attempted." She almost smiled. Almost. "I need Petra's letter before he arrives. If she's going to testify, I need her to say so clearly enough that no one can argue around it. Write to her tonight." "I was planning to." "I know." He looked back at the road. "There's something else I want to do, though I'd want to talk to Whitfield about it first." "What?" "The ranch deed. I want to add your name to it before the hearing." She stared at him. The wagon moved over a rough patch, and she steadied Lark without thinking, keeping her eyes on Rowan's profile. "Why?" she said. "Because right now you live on my land and you work this ranch, but it's not yours in any legal sense. If things go badly in court, if Crowe's lawyers start trying to establish that you have no independent stake here, that you're just housed, then having your name on the deed changes that. That's a legal strategy." "It's that too," he said. "But it's not only that." She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere in the dark and was answered by another, farther away, and then both were quiet. "Rowan," she said, "you don't have to say anything about it now." I wasn't going to argue about it." She stopped. "I was going to say thank you. That's all." He nodded once, looking at the road, and she looked at the road too, and the wagon rolled on toward home through the dark Nebraska night. Damian Crowe arrived in Kearney on the second Tuesday of April. She knew because Whitfield sent word ahead. He arrived by train Monday evening. Meeting as scheduled Wednesday, 10 o'clock. Bring everything. She and Rowan rode in the day before and stayed at a boarding house on the edge of town. A clean, spare place run by a woman who didn't ask questions and whose breakfast was good. Bryony put Lark to bed in the room and sat at the small desk near the window and wrote nothing, because there was nothing left to write. Everything was already in the documents. Everything was already said. All that was left was the room and the man and the sitting still through whatever he was going to perform. Rowan knocked on the open door between their rooms. "You should sleep." "I know." "Are you going to?" "Probably not." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the door frame, still dressed, arms crossed. "Have you ever been in a courtroom?" "Once. Land dispute with a neighbor, 7 years ago." "How did it go?" "We settled outside. I paid him $50 for 12 feet of fence line that was probably mine anyway. Seemed cheaper than the alternative." "Wise," she said. "Boring." He looked at her. "Whitfield knows what he's doing, and you know your ground. You've known it from the start. He's going to walk into that office looking like he's the injured party. He's going to be controlled and well-dressed and sad about it. He's very good at sad." "I know. And I'm going to be sitting there knowing exactly what he is and having to watch people look at him and see something reasonable." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing that for 4 years," he said. "You've already survived the hardest part of what he is. This is just the part where it goes on record." She looked at him. He said things like this sometimes, plain things that landed in exactly the right place, and she'd stopped being surprised by it, but she hadn't started taking it for granted. "Go to sleep," she said. "You too." He went. She sat by the window a while longer, listening to the town settle around her, to Lark's breathing in the small bed beside her, to the wind coming down the street. Then she lay down and stared at the ceiling and eventually, without meaning to, slept. Whitfield's office felt smaller with 5 people in it. Bryony and Rowan sat on one side of the room. Damian Crowe and his lawyer, a man named Fredericks, silver-haired, the expensive kind of careful, sat on the other. Whitfield sat between them behind his desk. She hadn't seen Damien in 7 months. He looked exactly the same, which was one of the things about men like him. They carried themselves as though the world's difficulty belonged to other people. He was well dressed, which she'd expected. Dark coat and a clean white collar, hair combed, the careful presentation of a man who understood how appearance operated. When he looked at her, his face arranged itself into something pained and personal, and she recognized the expression from 4 years of watching him use it. "Bryony," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. His eyes moved to Rowan, and the calculation was fast and almost invisible, the kind of assessment she'd watched him make in rooms for years. He looked back at her. "I'd like to see her," he said. "My daughter." "The purpose of this meeting," Whitfield said, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who'd already decided on the register of every sentence, "is to establish the parameters of any future contact arrangements, pending resolution of the custody question currently before the court. Mrs. Mercer has agreed to allow a supervised introduction today." Bryony had arranged for Lark to be held in the anteroom by the clerk's wife, a woman named Mrs. Holt, who'd been warned and paid, and who had a solid, capable look that Bryony had trusted on sight. She nodded to Whitfield. He stepped out briefly and came back with Mrs. Holt and the baby. Lark, at 7 months, had opinions about strangers. She looked at Damien Crow with the focused skepticism of an infant encountering an unfamiliar face and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Damien looked at the baby with an expression Bryony couldn't entirely read and that she refused to make assumptions about. Frederick said, "My client would like to hold the child." Whitfield said, "That's not part of today's arrangement. It's a simple request." "It's outside the agreed parameters," Whitfield said with no additional temperature. "We can note that the request was made." Damien looked at Bryony. "You see how it's going to be," he said. "You've surrounded yourself with lawyers, and that man," a small gesture toward Rowan, contemptuous enough to be almost elegant. "And you're going to make this a spectacle when all of this could have been handled privately." "You sent a man to watch my property," Bryony said. Damien's expression shifted slightly. "I don't know what you—" "March. A man on horseback at the eastern tree line for the better part of an afternoon." She kept her voice even. "He left tracks." Fredericks put a hand on Damien's arm, which was the signal Bryony had been expecting. The lawyer telling the client to stop talking because the client was about to say something that wouldn't look good. Damien sat back. He looked at Lark again, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He dropped the expression. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. What was underneath wasn't grief, wasn't love. It was calculation. How much this would cost. In what currencies. "What do you want?" he said, and it was addressed to her, not to either lawyer. "I want what I've already arranged," Bryony said. "A home for this child that you never intended to actually give her. Documentation of why that's true." She didn't raise her voice. She'd thought about this moment many times, how it might go, and she'd always assumed she'd want to say more. Wanted, in the small hours of various nights, to say all of it, to open the full record of what she'd watched in that house. But sitting across from him now, she found she only wanted to say the necessary parts. The rest of it was for the courtroom. She has a name. She has a home. She has a father who chose her. You can make this long and expensive, and she'll still have all of those things at the end of it. Damien looked at her for a long moment. He was still calculating. She could see it. "She's my blood," he said. "Yes," Bryony said, "and Vivian was your wife." The room was very quiet. Fredericks looked at his papers. Whitfield looked at the middle distance with the face of a man letting a moment land without interfering with it. Damien stood up. He straightened his jacket with both hands, the gesture of a man restoring presentation. "We'll see each other in court," he said. "We will," Bryony said. He left. Fredericks gathered his papers and followed, pausing at the door to nod to Whitfield with the collegial distance of opposing lawyers who had no personal feeling about any of this, which was accurate for Fredericks and which Bryony found both useful and deeply strange. When the door closed, Whitfield said, "That went better than I expected." Rowan looked at him. "How?" "He's angry. Angry men make mistakes." Whitfield made a note on his pad. "And she got him on the record about the surveillance, or close enough to it. Fredericks will have to manage that." Bryony was watching the door. Mrs. Holt had already taken Lark back to the anteroom, and Bryony could hear the baby making the sound she made when she was deciding whether to be upset about something. She wasn't upset. She was fine. They were both fine. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she'd been expecting. She put them in her lap. "When does he file?" Rowan asked. "His lawyers will file a formal custody petition within the month, most likely. We'll counter." Whitfield capped his pen. "I've had word from my contact in Lincoln. He found Eli Marsh." Bryony looked up. "He's willing to speak with you," Whitfield said. "He's been carrying that incident for a long time, it sounds like. Some people want to be asked." She thought about the young groundskeeper with shaking hands, the particular quality of someone who'd seen something they couldn't unknow. "I'll go to Lincoln. I'd recommend it. His testimony will be the strongest specific incident we have." Whitfield looked at both of them. "I want to be clear about where we are. We have a good case. We do not have a certain case. Crow has money and a lawyer who is very good at what he does, and biological paternity is a significant legal fact regardless of conduct. A judge could rule in ways that surprise us." "What are the chances?" Rowan said. "In our favor, 65%. Better if Marsh testifies to what you've described." Whitfield looked at Bryony. "And better if you testify well." "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means that on the stand you will be cross-examined by a man whose entire job is to make you look unstable, calculating, or dishonest. Fredericks will suggest you took the child for your own reasons, to use against Crow for money out of some personal grievance. He'll ask you questions designed to make anger or defensiveness look like guilt." Whitfield paused. "You'll need to be steady." "I've been steady my whole life," Bryony said. "I've had to be." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's what I needed to hear." She went to Lincoln 2 weeks later, taking the train alone while Rowan stayed with Lark. It was the first time she'd left the baby since the night she'd walked out the back door in Chicago with her, which struck her on the platform as something that should feel more complicated than it did. She'd kissed Lark on the top of the head and looked at Rowan holding her and thought, "She's fine. She's safe. I'll be back tomorrow," and gotten on the train. Eli Marsh was 24 and working at the Hartley Hotel as a front desk clerk, which explained why Whitfield's contact had found him. He was thinner than she remembered, with the look of a young man who'd learned to be careful about what he showed. He met her in the hotel lobby during his midday break, and they sat at a small table near the window and drank coffee, and he looked at his hands for most of the first few minutes. "I heard about you leaving," he said finally, "with the baby." "Did you?" "There was talk in the neighborhood for a while." He looked up. "I was glad. When I heard, I thought someone finally did something. I need you to tell a lawyer what you saw, what you told me, in the garden." He was quiet. Outside, a wagon went past, raising dust. "If I testify," he said, "what happens to me after? Can Crow?" "Whitfield will advise you. Legally, a witness testifying truthfully in a civil proceeding has substantial protection." She paused. "I won't lie to you and say there's no risk. He has money, and he'll use it to be unpleasant to people who cross him. But he'll be doing that anyway. The question is whether you let that stop you from saying what's true." Eli looked out the window. A long moment. "I was 19, he said, "when it happened. I didn't know what to do. I thought about going to the police, but I didn't think they'd... A man like that with money, you don't have to explain it to me. I just want you to know that I've thought about it, that I didn't just forget it and move on." "I know," she said. "That's why I came to find you." He looked at her. Something settled in his face. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll talk to your lawyer." She caught the evening train back and arrived at the ranch close to 9 at night. The house was lit from inside. Rowan was in the kitchen with Lark, who was sitting upright on the table. She'd been doing that for 2 weeks, balancing herself on her own, delighted with the accomplishment, and Rowan was reading something aloud to her from a newspaper, which was obviously not for her comprehension, but which she appeared to appreciate as a form of sound. He looked up when the door opened. "How did it go?" "He'll testify." Bryony took off her coat. "How was she?" "She ate. She slept once. She rolled off the blanket 3 times. He folded the newspaper. She kept waking up and looking for you." Bryony crossed to the table and picked Lark up. The baby grabbed her collar with both hands and made a sound that was complaint and relief at the same time. Bryony pressed her cheek against the top of Lark's head and closed her eyes for a moment. "Whitfield says we're ready," she said. "As ready as we're going to be." "When does it go to the judge?" "He's filing next week. Crow's lawyers will counter. Maybe 6 weeks before a hearing date." She opened her eyes. Lark was patting her face with one open hand, the baby version of checking that something was where it was supposed to be. 6 weeks to get through. Rowan looked at them both. He had that expression again, the one she'd been seeing more of since January, the careful, unguarded one. He stood up and came around the table and put a hand on her shoulder, briefly, the way you'd steady someone who didn't need steadying but who you were acknowledging anyway. "We'll get through it," he said. She nodded. She believed him. That was the thing she was still adjusting to. That she had started, incrementally and against her own resistance, to believe things people told her again. Not all people. Not easily. But him. Increasingly. This man who wrote letters in precise, practical sentences and mended fences before you mentioned them and read newspapers aloud to a 7-month-old in the evening because she seemed to like the sound. Outside, the spring night had turned warm and the prairie was doing what the prairie does in April, insisting loudly and with flowers that it had survived another winter and intended to make something of that fact. The frogs were going in the creek. The windmill turned in a light wind that smelled like green things and new soil, and the garden Bryony had planted a month ago that was already, improbably, beginning to come up. The hearing was 6 weeks away. The ground under them was solid. The case was built. The witnesses were ready, and in the morning there would be work to do, the same as every other morning, which was the only way any of it got done. The 6 weeks did not pass quickly. They passed the way difficult waiting always passes, unevenly, some days moving fast enough that she forgot to dread the end of them, and others stretching long and flat like the land itself, offering no cover and no shortcuts. Bryony worked. She worked the garden and the livestock and the 1,000 smaller tasks that a ranch generates. The way weather generates weather, one thing always leading to the next. And she was grateful for the physicality of it, for the way hard work requires the body's full attention and leaves the mind less room to turn over the same fears repeatedly. Rowan filed the deed transfer with the county in the last week of April. She'd gone with him to the county office, a small room in the courthouse building that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and signed her name next to his on the document and watched the clerk stamp it and record it in the ledger. Mercer, Rowan H., and Mercer, Bryony E. Joint tenancy, Harlan County. The clerk said the date and the amount and filed the copy, and that was that. On the way out, Rowan held the door and didn't say anything, and neither did she, and it was enough. Edith Graves at the general store heard about it within the week, which was not surprising, since Edith Graves heard about everything. She didn't bring it up directly. That wasn't her way. But when Bryony came in for supplies, she gave her a look that meant she knew, and said, "I heard there was some legal business at the courthouse," with the particular tone of someone who had made a conclusion and was offering you the chance to confirm it. "There was," Bryony said. Edith nodded slowly. "Good," she said, which coming from Edith was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She put an extra tin of baking powder in the order without being asked and didn't charge for it. Bryony chose not to mention it, and Edith chose not to explain it, and that was how a small friendship cemented itself without either party having to say anything embarrassing. Ruth Halsey was more direct. She caught Bryony outside the post office one morning and said, "I hear Rowan put the ranch in both your names." And when Bryony said yes, Ruth folded her arms across her chest and looked at her with the measuring gaze of a woman who'd watched marriages work and not work for 40 years and had developed opinions about the difference. "He's a serious man," Ruth said. "Not many of them are, at the root of it. Serious when it costs them something." "Yes," Bryony said. "You going to let yourself believe it?" The question landed more directly than she'd expected. Ruth Halsey had a way of that. Bryony looked at her for a moment. "I'm working on it," she said. Ruth made a sound that was not unsympathetic. "That's honest, at least." She patted Bryony on the arm, brief and practical, and went about her day. Petra arrived by train in the second week of May, 3 days before the hearing. Bryony met her at the station in Kearney. She'd traveled alone from Omaha, which took something. Petra was 43, solid and dark-haired, with the look of someone who'd worked hard most of her life and whose body had recorded every year of it honestly. She stepped off the train and saw Bryony and stopped, and Bryony stopped, and they looked at each other with the particular recognition of two people who'd shared a difficult place and gotten out of it by different routes. "You're well," Petra said. "I'm better," Bryony said. "You?" "Managing." She looked around the platform. "I don't much like trains." "There'll be a wagon back to the ranch. You can stay with us tonight and tomorrow. The hearing's the day after." Petra nodded. She picked up her bag and they walked to where Rowan was waiting with the wagon. He took Petra's bag without ceremony and stowed it and helped her up with a straightforwardness that Bryony had watched him offer to everyone. No performance, no charm offensive. Just a man doing the thing that was immediately in front of him to do. Petra looked at him with the evaluating eye of a woman who'd spent years in service and knew how to read men faster than most. On the road back, she and Bryony sat in the wagon bed while Rowan drove. They talked in the way of two people who'd needed to say certain things for a long time and were now finding the order of them. Not easily, not without gaps, but steadily. Petra talked about what it had been like to leave the Crow House, the particular flavor of relief and guilt that came with it. Bryony knew the guilt without being told, the way you feel guilty for surviving something someone else didn't. Vivian knew, Petra said. She knew what he was before the wedding. I think she married him hoping he was something she could change. She looked out at the passing land. Women do that. Yes, Bryony said. I should have done something sooner. You stayed as long as you did, and you're here now. Petra looked at her sideways. That's generous. It's true, Bryony said. The time before doesn't change the fact of what you're doing now. That night, Bryony cooked more than she usually did. It was a thing she did when she was anxious, cooked as though feeding people were a form of control over uncontrollable things. And they ate at the kitchen table, all four of them, which was a strange configuration. Lark sat in the wooden high chair Rowan had built in March, banging a spoon against the tray with the methodical satisfaction of someone who had discovered percussion. Petra watched the baby with an expression that kept shifting between tender and something harder and older. She looks like Vivian, Petra said quietly, around the eyes. Bryony looked at Lark. She'd noticed it too in recent months, as the baby's face had grown into itself. There was something there that was Vivian, not dominant, not defining, but present, the way certain inheritances are. She does a little, she said. Vivian would have liked this. Petra gestured at the table, the room. She used to talk about wanting a house where the kitchen wasn't just a place servants went. Nobody said anything for a moment. The lamplight was warm and the night outside was mild, and Lark moved on from percussion to trying to feed herself with the spoon, which was going poorly but with great commitment. Rowan said, "More coffee?" Petra held out her cup. "Thank you," she said, and then to Bryony, "You picked well." "I got lucky," Bryony said. "Those aren't always different things." The morning of the hearing, Bryony was up at 4 and didn't bother pretending to sleep after that. She dressed carefully, not elaborately, but with the same attention she'd have given to anything that mattered, and went downstairs and found Rowan already at the table with coffee, which had become their version of steadiness. The shared morning quiet that said, "We're here. We're doing this." "Ready?" he said. "Ask me in 8 hours." He handed her a cup. "Whitfield's good," he said. "I've been watching him. He doesn't perform confidence. He just has it. That means something." "I know." She drank the coffee. "I'm less worried about Whitfield than about what happens when I'm on the stand. I keep going over it in my head." "What does going over it tell you?" "That I know it's true. That I can say it." She set down the cup. "That Fredericks is going to try to make me look like I stole that baby." "You didn't steal her," Rowan said, with a flatness that wasn't dismissal but conviction. "You saved her, and will say so, in whatever language the courtroom needs." Petra was composed at breakfast in the way of someone who'd made their decision and was now simply executing it, which Bryony recognized and respected. Lark stayed at the ranch with Agnes Polk, who'd offered with the matter-of-fact practicality that was Agnes's mode of generosity. "I'll sit with the baby, someone has to." And who Bryony trusted precisely because Agnes didn't offer things she wasn't prepared to do. The courtroom in Kearney was smaller than Bryony had expected. She'd built it large in her imagination over the past weeks. High ceilings, crowded gallery, the theatrical weight of institutions. And what she walked into was a plain room with wooden benches, a judge's bench that was elevated but not imposingly so, and windows on the south wall that let in a May morning's light in a way that made the whole business feel both ordinary and serious, which she supposed it was. Damien was already seated with Fredericks when they arrived. He looked the same as he had in Whitfield's office, controlled, well-presented, the performance of reasonable grief worn with the ease of long practice. He didn't look at her when she came in, which was its own kind of statement. Judge Emmett Caro was perhaps 60, with the unhurried bearing of a man who'd heard a great many cases and been surprised by fewer and fewer of them as the years went on. He read the filed documents with the careful attention of someone who actually read rather than skimmed, and Bryony watched him and tried to understand what she was seeing and couldn't, which Whitfield had told her was normal. Fredericks opened for Damien Crowe with the smooth precision of a very good lawyer establishing narrative. He presented Damien as a man of means and standing, recently bereaved, who had discovered that his infant daughter had been removed from Chicago without his knowledge or consent by a former household employee. He used the phrase former household employee 3 times in 10 minutes. He said biological father twice. He said established home once, with a slight emphasis on established that meant to imply everything Bryony's situation was not. He was very good at it, and she sat through it with her hands folded in her lap and made no expression. Whitfield's opening was shorter and less polished, which she'd learned by now was deliberate. He let the facts speak without dressing them. He said that Lark Mercer was a child who had been abandoned in practical terms before she was born, raised for the first 4 months of her life by the woman now seeking formal custody, who had subsequently married and established a home and begun adoption proceedings. He said that the child's father's fitness would be the central question, and that the evidence would answer it. Fredericks called Damien first. She watched him on the stand and tried to do what Whitfield had advised. Listen for the structure, not the surface. Damien was good. He was measured and specific and used the right language. My daughter, my concern, the shock of finding her gone. He described Bryony as a troubled young woman who had become inappropriately attached to the baby during his wife's illness. He said he'd always intended to make proper arrangements for the child's care once the grief of losing Vivian had subsided. He said he was a father who wanted what was best for his daughter. He was very convincing. She felt the jury of her own emotions trying to second-guess what she knew, the way a good performance will do, and she pressed both feet flat on the floor and breathed through it. When Whitfield cross-examined, he was quiet and methodical. He asked about the household accounts, specifically the period between Lark's birth and Vivian's death, 7 weeks. How many times had Damien visited the nursery during those 7 weeks? Damien said regularly. How many times per week? On average. Damien said several. Could he describe specifically any of those visits? Damien described one, in general terms, and Whitfield let it sit and moved on. He asked about the night Vivian died. Damien had been at a dinner. Who had been with Vivian? The nurse. Any family? No. Had Damien been sent for when Vivian's condition worsened? He had. Had he come? He had arrived afterward. Fredericks objected to the characterization. Whitfield said he was simply establishing timeline. The judge allowed it. Damien's face had not changed significantly through any of this. That was in its way its own evidence, though not the kind you could put in a record. Petra testified that afternoon. She sat in the witness box with her hands folded and spoke in the direct, unornamented way of someone who'd decided that plain truth was the most they owed anyone. She described specific incidents over her 2 years in the Crowe household, a broken door, a bruise Vivian had explained with a different story each time, the instructions Damien had given regarding Vivian's correspondence. She didn't editorialize. She said what she'd seen and what she'd heard, and when Fredericks cross-examined and suggested she was embittered by her dismissal from the household, she said she had given her own notice and left of her own choice, and she said it with a steadiness that was more persuasive than any amount of indignation. Bryony testified the following morning. She'd slept 4 hours the night before, which was not great but was enough. She'd lain next to Lark in the boarding house bed. Agnes had brought the baby in from the ranch that evening, and listened to her breathe and thought about what Whitfield had said. You know what's true. Say what you know. On the stand, she looked at Whitfield when he asked questions and answered as plainly as she could. She described what she'd observed over 4 years. She described the night Vivian died and the days after. She described the decision to leave not as something emotional, not as a rescue narrative, but as a practical assessment. This child was not going to be cared for, and she was in a position to care for her. And so she had. Fredericks cross-examined for 40 minutes. He was skilled and patient, and he tried several angles. The claim that she'd acted out of attachment disorder, which she answered calmly. The suggestion that she'd wanted a child she couldn't have by other means, which she didn't react to. The implication that Rowan Mercer was a man who'd bought himself a ready-made family through financial arrangement, which she answered so simply and directly that it collapsed under its own weight. "You chose this child," Fredericks said, "not her father." "Yes," she said. "And you believe that gives you more right to her than her biological parent." "I believe it gives Lark more right to a home where she is chosen," she said. "Yes." Fredericks looked at his papers. He asked 2 more questions that didn't go anywhere and sat down. Eli Marsh testified last on the second day. He was young on that stand, younger than his 24 years, the kind of young that comes from being frightened. And his voice was not entirely steady at first, but he knew what he'd seen. He described an afternoon in the garden behind the Crow house, what he'd witnessed through the hedge, what Vivian had said afterward when she'd found him still there. He said he'd thought about going to the police and hadn't, and he said he was sorry for that, and when he said it, he was looking at Bryony rather than the judge. And she looked back at him steadily so he'd have somewhere to land. Fredericks attacked the testimony harder than he'd attacked any of the others. He questioned Eli's angle of vision, his distance, his interpretation, his age at the time, his possible motivations. Eli held through all of it. Not perfectly. He stumbled twice, had to be redirected by Whitfield on redirect, but he held the substance of it, the plain core of what he'd seen, and that was what mattered. Judge Caro announced that he would take 1 day to review and deliver his ruling. That day was the longest Bryony could remember since the night she'd walked out of Chicago. She and Rowan and Petra sat in the boarding house and mostly didn't talk. Rowan read. Petra mended something she'd brought with her. She apparently traveled with mending, which Bryony found obscurely comforting. Bryony sat with Lark on the floor and helped her practice standing, holding her small hands while she pulled herself upright and stood wobbling on legs that were still figuring out what they were for. "She's close to walking," Petra said. "Whitfield says another month or 2, Rowan said, and then looked up at Bryony with an expression that admitted he'd just said something slightly absurd. "You've been asking the lawyer about the baby's development?" Bryony said. "He has a grandchild. He mentioned it. It came up." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression that wasn't quite a smile. She felt something loosen in her chest, some knot that had been there for days, and she breathed through it and looked back at Lark, who had sat down abruptly and seemed satisfied with this outcome. The ruling came the following afternoon, in the same plain courtroom with the same south-facing windows. Judge Caro read from a prepared document, which meant he'd decided overnight and written his reasons in full, which Whitfield had said was a good sign. A judge who'd decided quickly and was confident in his reasoning. The language was formal, and she followed it with difficulty, catching the operative phrases as they surfaced. The evidence presented demonstrates a pattern of neglect and conduct incompatible with the best interests of the minor child. She caught that. The testimony of multiple witnesses corroborates a household environment that posed demonstrable risk. She caught that. The petitioner has failed to establish that his claim of paternal interest reflects genuine and consistent concern for the child's welfare rather than proprietary interest. That one she had to hear twice before it resolved into meaning. And then, custody of the minor child Lark Mercer is awarded to Bryony Mercer, the child's established caretaker and legal mother by adoption proceeding. The respondent's custody claim is denied in full. Adoption by Rowan Mercer to proceed without impediment. She heard Petra exhale beside her. She heard Whitfield say something to his papers. She felt Rowan's hand close over hers on the bench, briefly, and she held it for a moment and let go. Across the room, Damien Crow sat very still. Fredericks was already leaning toward him, speaking in a low voice. Damien didn't look at Bryony. He stared at the front of the room with the expression of a man recalculating what the costs would actually be, adding them up in a currency she would never entirely understand. Then he stood and put on his hat and left the courtroom with the straight-back control of a man who would not let anyone see him absorb a defeat. She watched him go. She waited until the sound of his footsteps in the corridor had stopped, And then she sat for another moment in the plain wooden courtroom with the Maylight coming in the windows and let it be real. Let the ruling exist in her body as something more than words. Whitfield shook hands with both of them, and then with Petra, who received it with the gravity it deserved. "We'll complete the adoption paperwork this week," he said. "Procedural, nothing contested." He looked at Bryony. "You testified very well." "I told the truth," she said. Most people do. Most people aren't that good at it." Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was warm and the main street of Kearney was doing its ordinary business. People moving along the boards, wagons in the street, a dog sleeping in a patch of sun with the absolute commitment of a dog that has found exactly the right spot. The world had not reorganized itself for the occasion of the ruling, which was right. It was just a May afternoon in a Nebraska town, and they were standing in it. Petra stood beside her and didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to catch the evening train." "You could stay another night." "I know." Petra looked at her. "But I think you don't need me anymore, and that's a good thing. That's what I came for." Bryony looked at her. She thought about the letter that had arrived in February with, "I will stand in the middle of it," what it had cost to write those 3 words, what it costs anyone to stand up for something after they've been made to feel that standing up is not available to them. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Petra nodded once, precise and final. "Take care of that baby," she said. "Take care of yourself." And she picked up her bag and walked toward the station. The wagon ride back to the ranch was nothing like the rides before it. Not the tense silence of the trip to meet Whitfield. Not the weight of the overnight before the hearing. It was quieter in a different way. The quiet after something has been decided rather than before. Lark was in Bryony's lap, falling asleep against her chest with the totality that babies fall asleep, all at once and completely. The evening sky was doing the thing it did in Nebraska in May. Enormous and layered, more colors than you expected, pink going to orange going to a particular deep blue at the top that she'd learned to recognize as home. She thought about what Ruth Halsey had asked her weeks ago. "Are you going to let yourself believe it?" She thought, yes, not all at once, not without remainder, not the way she'd believed things at 19 before she'd learned what believing cost you, but the steady, eyes-open kind of believing that knows the risk and chooses anyway. The kind that isn't foolish because it's earned. Rowan was looking at the road. He'd been quiet since the courthouse, not the withdrawn kind of quiet, but the settled kind. "Rowan," she said. He looked at her. "The deed," she said. "The ranch. You did that before you knew how the ruling would go." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road again. "Because the ruling wasn't the point," he said. "You were already here. That was already true." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the sky, at Lark sleeping against her chest with her small hand fisted in Bryony's coat, at the road unrolling ahead of them toward the ranch and the garden and the barn and the life they'd been building all winter while everything else was uncertain. It was not a perfect moment. Her back ached from 2 days on courthouse benches. Lark was going to wake up hungry in approximately 20 minutes. There was a fence section in the north pasture that needed attention, and the bean row was probably due for watering, and she'd left a list of things for Agnes on the kitchen table and wasn't sure she'd covered everything. It was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was what enough actually looked like, up close, without the distance that made things seem simpler than they were. She let herself have it. Agnes Polk was sitting on the porch when the wagon turned down the ranch road, Lark on her knee and a cup of something hot in her free hand, watching them come in with the unhurried expression of a woman who'd been waiting and didn't mind it. She stood when they pulled up and handed the baby over without ceremony and said, "She ate twice and yelled about it both times, and she's fine." And that was Agnes's version of a warm welcome, which Bryony had come to appreciate for exactly what it was. "How did it go?" Agnes said. "We won," Rowan said, climbing down from the wagon. Agnes looked at him, then at Bryony. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she'd already decided, and went inside to leave her cup and collect her coat. On her way out, she stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "I'll tell Ruth," and left. By the following week, everyone in Harker's Fork knew. Bryony hadn't told anyone herself. She didn't have to. The news moved the way news moves in small places. through the ordinary transactions of people who see each other at the store and the post office and the livery. And what came back to her was not the cautious watching she'd been navigating since October, but something different. People looked at her and nodded with the specific weight of acknowledgement, the kind that means we know what you did and we know what it cost. Edith Graves stopped calling her the Mercer woman and started calling her Bryony. Ruth Halsey said nothing at all, just squeezed her arm outside the post office and walked on, which from Ruth was a declaration. Even the men who'd been most uncertain around her, the ones who'd looked at the mail-order arrangement with the particular skepticism of people who believe practicality and marriage are categories that shouldn't overlap. Even some of them came around, or at least moved toward a version of around. One of the ranchers who shared a fence line with Rowan, a laconic man named Dearborn who'd never offered more than 2 words at a time, stopped him on the road one morning and said, "Heard about the court business. Good outcome," which was, Bryony gathered, the frontier equivalent of a parade. She was learning that acceptance in a place like this didn't arrive as a single event. It accumulated, the way soil accumulates around a new planting, slowly, incrementally, and then one day you looked and the roots were in and the thing was there, and there was no longer a question of whether it would hold. The adoption was finalized in June, on a warm Thursday that smelled of cut grass and the particular sweetness of early summer. Whitfield had been right about it being procedural. There was paperwork, there was a clerk, there were signatures, and then it was done. Lark Mercer, daughter of Rowan and Bryony Mercer, Harlan County, Nebraska. On the record, permanent. Bryony held the document and read her daughter's name and felt the thing in her chest that she'd been holding at careful distance since October, not letting herself fully have it, not trusting it entirely. She felt it release, quietly and completely, like a breath she'd been holding for 8 months. Rowan looked at the document over her shoulder. "She'll want to see that someday," he said. "Yes." "We should keep it somewhere she can find it." "I know exactly where." She folded it carefully and put it with the other documents she kept. The deed, the letter from Petra, the early letters from Whitfield, in the box under the bedroom floorboard, which had started its life in her possession as a hiding place and had gradually become something else, a record, a proof of survival that had turned into something more than survival. The summer that followed was the first season Bryony spent on the ranch without the background weight of crisis. Every season before it, the autumn of her arrival, the brutal winter, the long, anxious spring, had been shadowed by what was coming, by the waiting and the preparing and the knowledge that Damian Crow and his careful lawyers were somewhere out there calculating. Now that was gone. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The way a pain goes when the cause of it has been removed, you realize it's absent because you've stopped bracing for it. She worked the garden through June and July with the satisfaction of someone doing a thing they've chosen for reasons that belong entirely to themselves. The bean row Rowan had helped her relocate came in well. The tomatoes, the difficult ones she'd planted against the south-facing barn wall, the ones that were hard to justify by pure practicality, came in better than she'd expected, improbably, stubbornly, with the particular determination of something given just enough warmth and left to its own devices. She stood among them one August morning with Lark on her hip, picking what was ripe, and she thought about the woman who'd arrived at this yard in October mud with a 4-month-old she'd taken on the logic of pure necessity, with no plan beyond the immediate one, with a level of fear she'd been managing so constantly that she'd stopped recognizing it as fear. Lark, at 11 months, was on the absolute edge of walking. She'd been on that edge for 3 weeks, which was apparently normal, but felt like the longest suspense Bryony had endured since the courthouse. She could pull herself up on anything: furniture, fence posts, Rowan's leg if he was standing still long enough, and she'd stand wobbling with the intense focused expression she got when she was working at something, and then she'd sit down abruptly and start over. Bryony had stopped hovering. You couldn't help her with this part. You just had to be close enough. She took her first steps on a Tuesday in late August. In the kitchen, in the early morning before anyone had fully planned their day, she was holding the edge of the table and she simply let go and walked to Rowan, 4 steps, and then grabbed his knee and looked up at him with an expression of complete astonishment. He looked down at her. Then he looked at Bryony. "Did that—" he started. "Yes," Bryony said. Lark sat down on the kitchen floor and appeared to consider what had just happened. Then she pulled herself up on Rowan's knee again and turned around and walked back to the table. 5 steps this time. She grabbed the table edge and looked around to see if anyone had noticed, and both of them were watching, which appeared to satisfy her. Rowan sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not something she'd seen him do before, and held out his hands. Lark looked at him with that focused expression and walked to him, and he caught her when she reached him, and she grabbed 2 fistfuls of his flannel shirt and said something that wasn't a word yet, but had the quality of one, the intention of one. And he said, "I know," in the tone of a man answering something he understood perfectly. Bryony stood at the stove and watched them and felt the complicated fullness of the moment. The way happiness, real happiness, the kind that's been earned through difficulty, carries its history inside it. The fear was there too, not sharp anymore, but present, the way old injuries announce themselves in cold weather. She'd been afraid for so long that it had become structural, part of how she understood the world to work. That didn't disappear because things had gone well. It learned to coexist with the better things, and slowly, over time, it lost its dominance. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over, that it wasn't a clean break. You carried what you'd come from. It went into how you held your shoulders, how quickly you looked toward the door when something moved outside, how long it took you to accept a kindness at face value. The frontier had not erased Bryony Ashcroft's past. It had given her the room and the time to build something around it, and what you built around an old wound was the thing that defined you more than the wound itself. She was still learning how to receive things without anticipating the cost. Rowan had learned not to announce good things to her, not the deed transfer, not small gestures, because she received them better when they simply appeared and she found them herself. He'd figured this out by paying attention, which was how he figured most things out, and she'd noticed that he'd figured it out without ever saying so, without making her explain herself, which was its own kind of grace. They argued sometimes. She'd been waiting for that, waiting to see what his temper looked like, what the underside of his patience was. What she found was that he went quiet and tight-jawed when he was angry rather than loud, and that the tight-jawed silences were finite, that he came back out of them and said what he'd actually been thinking when he was ready and not before. She found she could work with this. She was not without fault in arguments herself. She had a tendency toward cold precision when she was upset that she'd been told before was difficult to be on the receiving end of, and she knew it was true and couldn't always stop it. They'd had 2 real arguments in their first year that had lasted into the evening and resolved without either of them backing down completely, which felt about right. Once, after the harder of the 2, he'd sat across from her at the kitchen table after it was settled and said, "I'm not good at this." At what? At, he gestured between them, at being 2 people in the same house. "You've been alone a long time." "Yes." He looked at the table. "I'm better at it than I was in October, I think." "You are," she said, and then, "So am I." He looked up at that. She let him look. She wrote to Petra twice that summer, real letters, not about legal things, but about the ordinary facts of the days, the garden, Lark walking, a story about Rowan and the eggs that she thought Petra would appreciate, which she apparently did, because Petra's reply had a quality of warmth that hadn't been fully present in the earlier ones. The warmth of someone allowing themselves to be glad for someone else without reservation. Petra had taken a job she liked, in a household that was, by her account, unremarkable in the best possible way, which after the Crow House was the highest praise available. Bryony kept her letters. She intended to keep writing them. She heard nothing from Damien Crow after the ruling. Whitfield told her in July that Fredericks had made an informal inquiry about appeal grounds and found them insufficient, which meant the ruling was settled, which meant it was over. She sat with that information for a day before it felt true. Then it felt true. She didn't celebrate exactly, because it wasn't this kind of thing she could celebrate the way you celebrated a harvest or a fair weather stretch. It was the closing of a door that had been trying to stay open, and what you felt about a closed door was mostly relief that it was closed. In September, almost exactly 1 year after she'd stepped off a stagecoach into October mud, Bryony went out to the garden in the early morning to pull the last of the summer plants before the first frost came, and she brought Lark with her, because Lark now walked everywhere and wanted to be where things were happening. She gave her a small stick to carry, which was acceptable to Lark's sensibilities, and they worked through the garden in the long, early light. Bryony pulling plants and Lark following with her stick, occasionally stopping to look closely at something at ground level the way small children look at the world. Not from above, but from within it, with total attention, as if everything is worth investigating. Rowan came out after an hour with coffee and sat on the garden fence and didn't help, which she didn't need, just sat there the way you sit when you want to be where something is happening even if it's not your particular work. 1 year, he said. She looked up. Yesterday, technically, I got here on a Thursday. How does it feel? She stood up with a handful of dead bean vines and looked around the garden at what it was compared to what it had been. The bare beds of March, the tentative plantings of April, the full growing season now at its end, leaving behind its organized evidence of what had been done here by two people who'd needed to figure out the language for it as they went. It feels like I live here, she said. He looked at her. You do. I know that now. She dropped the vines and dusted her hands on her work pants. I feel it, not just know it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression she'd never quite named, the careful, unguarded one. When did that change? She thought about it honestly. I'm not sure. It was slow. There wasn't one day. She looked at Lark, who had found something in the dirt that required serious investigation with the stick. Maybe when she walked, maybe before that, maybe when you sat on the kitchen floor. He didn't ask what that meant. He knew. She picked up her coffee, which he'd brought out black the way she took it, without being asked, because after a year he knew. She drank it and looked at the Nebraska morning. The flat, wide sky beginning to go the particular blue of early September. The windmill turning in a light west wind, the barn going gray in that faithful, weathered way. The pasture grass moving. She thought about what she'd told herself in October, standing in that yard for the first time, cold and tired and trying to stay practical. This is what you chose. Now see what it is. She'd seen it. It was hard and imperfect and sometimes funny in ways she hadn't expected and occasionally frustrating in ways she also hadn't expected. And it was hers. Not because a court said so, not because a deed said so, though both of those things were true. Because she'd built it. One January morning and one March garden bed, and one long summer evening, and one argument resolved, and one ordinary breakfast at a time. She had built a life inside a life she'd agreed to without knowing what it was. That was the thing about necessity that nobody mentioned, that sometimes necessity chooses better than you would have chosen for yourself, because necessity doesn't have the luxury of all the reasons not to try. She hadn't chosen Rowan Mercer because she trusted him. She'd chosen him because she was out of options, and then she'd watched him be trustworthy until trusting him was simply what was accurate. And then somewhere in there, she'd stopped watching for the thing underneath and started just seeing him. You couldn't design that. You couldn't engineer the specific slow accumulation of it. You could only stay present for it, which required a kind of courage that looked nothing like the dramatic kind, but was harder in its way. The courage of remaining available to something good when you had every reason to close yourself against it. Lark abandoned the stick in favor of trying to eat a clod of dirt, which Bryony intercepted without drama and redirected toward a small pebble that was acceptable to hold. She picked her daughter up and settled her on her hip, and Lark grabbed her collar with both hands, the old gesture, the checking gesture, the one that meant you're here, good. Bryony held her. She's going to be taller than both of us, Rowan said. You have no idea what she's going to be. No, he said. That's the part I'm looking forward to. She looked at him. He was watching Lark with the expression he'd had since December, the one that had started as careful and become something else entirely, something that had its own name now, even if none of them said it. She thought about the night he'd sat up carving a bird for a baby he'd never met, because she didn't have any toys and someone had noticed. She thought about a child is not a problem. Come when you're ready. 6 words she'd stared at for 2 days, half convinced they were a lie, half desperate for them to be true. They were true. That was the conclusion she'd arrived at, the long way around. The first frost came 2 weeks later, and the garden was ready for it. Bryony had put up the tomatoes and the beans and the root vegetables through August and September. The shelves in the cellar lined with jars that she'd made with her own hands from seeds she'd ordered and soil she'd turned herself. And when the cold came down overnight and silvered the grass and found the emptied beds, there was nothing left for it to take. The work was already done and stored and real. She stood at the kitchen window in the early morning and looked out at the frost and drank her coffee and thought, next year I'll add a second bed of tomatoes. The south wall has enough warmth for it. I know that now. Behind her, Rowan was making breakfast with the focused, imperfect effort he brought to breakfast, never getting the eggs quite right the first try, always correcting. Lark was in her high chair, banging the tray. The stove was hot. The house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular smell of a kitchen where someone had been cooking most mornings for most of a year. Outside, the Nebraska sky was doing what it always did, enormous and changeable, and indifferent to individual human concerns, which was oddly comforting. It didn't care about her past. It didn't care about Cook County custody rulings or Chicago households or mail-order advertisements or any of it. It just went on being sky, the same sky it had been before she arrived and would be after, and she was here under it with her coffee and her daughter, and the man who'd told her the truth in 6 words and meant it. She had not arrived here seeking happiness. She'd arrived seeking safety, which is a different, smaller thing. The floor of what a life needs rather than the ceiling of it. Somewhere between the first October mud and the September garden, she'd moved off the floor. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. And she was not going to waste it. She turned from the window. The egg situation at the stove appeared to require attention. "Move over," she said. "I'll do the eggs." "I had a plan," Rowan said. "The plan isn't working." "It was working until you said that." "Scoot." He scooted. She took the pan and worked it, and he stood at her shoulder and watched with the comfortable proximity of a man who'd stopped needing a reason to be close to someone, who'd gotten past the self-conscious phase of it and into the simple fact of it. And she felt him there without looking, and that too was something she'd learned. That you didn't have to look at the things you were certain of. Lark threw her spoon on the floor. It was the 3rd time that morning. Rowan picked it up without comment and handed it back, and Lark received it with the solemn gratitude of someone who has not yet realized she was the one who dropped it. Bryony put the eggs on the plates and set them on the table and sat down, and they ate breakfast in the warm kitchen on a frosty September morning, the 3 of them, imperfect and present and exactly where they had chosen to be.